Imagine being trapped in a room where the air is permanently 5 degrees colder than the rest of the hallway. A room where the shadows don't mimic the furniture, but move independently against the wall. In the mid-20th century, Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky, was a terminal destination for thousands suffering from the White Plague, tuberculosis. But among all the horrors witnessed within its Gothic limestone walls, Room 502 holds a uniquely malicious legacy that has driven grown men to drop their equipment and sprint from the building in absolute terror. The room is haunted not by a passive memory, but by an aggressive, intelligent entity that despises the living, born from a double tragedy that occurred within those specific four walls. For decades, urban explorers, paranormal investigators, and former staff members have reported a crushing sense of despair the moment they cross the threshold, followed by the distinct, unmistakable sound of a woman's disembodied voice whispering a single chilling command: "Get out." The nightmare began in 1928. Tuberculosis was tearing through the state, and Waverly Hills was overflowing with patients who were essentially sent there to die. The stress on the medical staff was unimaginable. A young nurse whose identity has been fiercely debated, but whose tragic end is undisputed, was found hanging from the light fixture in room 502. She was unmarried and pregnant, a massive social scandal at the time, and the crushing weight of her circumstances supposedly drove her to take her own life. Her body hung there for hours before a frantic orderly discovered it. The atmosphere of the room curdled instantly, permanently stained by her final moments of absolute panic and isolation. Yet, the room wasn't finished demanding blood. Just 4 years later, in 1932, another nurse who was assigned to the exact same room mysteriously plunged from the window of room 502, falling multiple stories to her death on the concrete below. Investigators at the time claimed that she jumped, but co-workers insisted she had been complaining for weeks that something else was sharing the room with her, constantly pushing her toward the edge. When the sanatorium finally closed its doors in 1961, the building sat abandoned, decaying in the Kentucky woods, but the energy inside room 502 only grew more volatile. Modern investigators who brave the upper floors frequently report seeing a distinct humanoid shape composed of absolute darkness, standing directly in the doorway of the room. This isn't just a trick of the light, it is the infamous Shadow Man of Waverly Hills. Unlike normal shadows that stretch and fade when a flashlight is shone upon them, this entity absorbs light. Witnesses describe it as a solid, deep black silhouette that stands roughly 6 feet tall. It doesn't walk, it glides with a sickening smoothness. When teams set up high-tech audio equipment inside room 502, the electronic voice phenomena, EVP, captured that are terrifyingly clear. In one notable investigation, a team asked, "Is there anyone here with us?" The response, captured on a digital recorder in a raspy, feminine tone, was, "I'm hanging." The physical sensations experienced by those who enter room 502 are intensely visceral. Visitors frequently describe an immediate crushing pressure on their chests, making it difficult to breathe, a cruel echo of the tuberculosis patients who once gasped for air in those very hallways. Skeptics often attribute this to the natural anxiety of being in a creepy, abandoned building. But the physical evidence tells a different story. Dozens of independent investigators have documented identical, unexplainable scratches appearing on their arms and backs after spending time in the room. These aren't minor abrasions, they are deep red welts that burn like fire, often appearing in sets of 3. A classic paranormal sign of a malevolent presence mocking the Holy Trinity. The entity in room 502 doesn't just want to be noticed. It wants to inflict physical discomfort on anyone who dares to disturb its eternal grief. To this day, Waverly Hills stands as a monument to human suffering. But room 502 remains its beating, blackened heart. Tour guides who walk the property daily refuse to stay near the room after sundown. They report hearing the rapid click-clack of nursing shoes on the concrete floor when the building is entirely empty, accompanied by the distinct smell of old-fashioned antiseptic and copper. The entity seems to cycle through states of sorrow and outright malice. One minute, a faint, weeping sound can be heard coming from the back corner of the room. The next, a heavy wooden door will slam shut with enough force to shatter the frame, locking investigators inside. It is a space where the veil between the living and the dead hasn't just worn thin. It has been completely torn away, leaving behind a predatory remnant of the past that continues to watch, wait, and terrorize anyone foolish enough to step inside. There is a subterranean world beneath the rolling hills of Spring City, Pennsylvania, where the walls are covered in peeling paint and the air tastes like rust and old blood. This is the tunnel system of the Pennhurst State School and Hospital, an institution originally built to care for mentally and physically disabled individuals, which instead became an industrial complex of institutional cruelty. But the true horror of Pennhurst didn't end when the state finally forced it to close in 1987 due to horrific patient abuse. The unbridled agony, anger, and terror of thousands of forgotten souls became trapped in the subterranean concrete tunnels used to transport supplies and, far too often, dead bodies. Today, paranormal teams equipped with thermal imaging cameras have captured terrifying footage of things crawling along the ceilings of these tunnels, shapes that do not possess human geometry, moving with a frenzied, unnatural speed toward anyone who dares to light up the dark. The history of Pennhurst is a dark stain on American medical history. Built in 1908, it quickly became severely overcrowded and understaffed. Patients were subjected to unimaginable neglect. Many were strapped to metal cribs for days at a time, left in their own filth, or subjected to brutal physical restraints. The anger and despair in the atmosphere were palpable. When a human being experiences that level of prolonged, agonizing trauma, they leave an energetic imprint on the physical environment. In Pennhurst, this energy concentrated in the basement tunnels. Staff members used these tunnels to move quietly between buildings during brutal winter storms, but they quickly began avoiding them altogether. Nurses reported hearing their names called out by raspy voices from the pitch-black alcoves. And multiple security guards resigned after witnessing heavy steel gurneys rolling down the corridors completely under their own power, violently smashing into the walls as if thrown by an invisible, raging force. The most terrifying entity residing in the Pennhurst tunnels is known among paranormal researchers as the Overlord. Unlike the lingering spirits of the patients, which manifest as faint crying or childish whispers, the Overlord is a massive, oppressive presence that exudes pure malice. It is believed to be the astral remnant of a particularly sadistic supervisor who took pleasure in torturing the vulnerable residents. Witnesses who have encountered the Overlord describe an overwhelming sense of dread that causes immediate nausea and dizziness. When viewed through thermal cameras, this entity appears as a massive, dark mass that drops the ambient temperature by 20 degrees instantly. It doesn't just lurk in the shadows, it actively attacks. Investigators have been violently shoved to the ground, pinned against the damp concrete walls, and left with deep, burning bruises that match the shape of a massive, heavy hand. The auditory phenomena in the Pennhurst tunnels are uniquely disturbing because of how the concrete architecture amplifies sound. In the dead of night, the silence is regularly shattered by a sound that resembles a heavy iron pipe striking the metal support beams, followed by a low, guttural growl that vibrates through the floorboards. Audio technicians have captured EVPs of what sounds like an organized, chaotic riot. Dozens of overlapping voices screaming, begging for mercy, and laughing maniacally all at once, compressed into a few seconds of tape. One of the most famous audio captures from the site features a deep, authoritative voice saying, "I'm the boss here," followed immediately by the sound of a patient sobbing in despair. The audio is so clear that it sounds as though the speaker is standing inches from the microphone, breathing heavily into the lens. Visiting the Pennhurst tunnels today is an exercise in surviving psychological warfare. The entities here have learned how to manipulate the environment to maximize fear. Flashlight batteries, fully charged camera packs, and heavy-duty generator lines drain to 0% within seconds of entering the lower levels, plunging teams into absolute suffocating darkness. In that blackness, the ambient sounds of the old asylum change. The dripping of water is replaced by the sound of dragging footsteps, wet breaths right behind your neck, and the terrifying sensation of cold, phantom fingers lightly brushing against your face. Pennhurst is not just a haunted hospital. It is a living, breathing reservoir of historical trauma that actively feeds on the fear of the living, reminding every visitor that once you enter the tunnels, the past never truly lets you leave. What happens when a hospital closes, but the medical staff refuses to clock out? At the Old Toole County Hospital in Shelby, Montana, the phantom scent of rubbing alcohol and burning flesh still drifts through the abandoned operating rooms. And the call lights on the walls still blink to life, signaling for assistance in rooms that have been completely empty for decades. Built in the late 1920s, this remote medical facility served a rugged, isolated community, witnessing countless grueling surgeries, tragic deaths, and desperate measures. But long after the last living patient was discharged, local residents and brave overnight visitors began noticing that the lights inside the building would turn on and off in a rhythmic, calculated sequence. When investigators finally went inside to find the source, they discovered that the hospital's deceased doctors and nurses were still performing surgeries on phantom patients, entirely indifferent to the fact that their flesh had long since rotted away. The atmosphere within the Old Toole County Hospital is uniquely eerie because it remains largely intact, looking as though the staff simply evaporated mid-shift. In the main operating theater, the massive, rusted surgical light still hangs over a stained porcelain table. It is here that the most disturbing activity occurs. Multiple eyewitnesses, including local law enforcement officers checking the property for vandals, have reported looking through the cracked glass windows of the operating room and seeing a group of figures dressed in vintage, blood-stained surgical scrubs standing around the table. They move with rhythmic, professional precision, gesturing for instruments and leaning over a phantom body. However, when a flashlight beam hits the group, they don't vanish instantly like a traditional ghost. Instead, they slowly turn their heads in unison toward the intruder, their faces completely blank and featureless, before dissolving into a thick gray mist. The paranormal activity here is heavily mechanical, which terrifies investigators because it requires a massive amount of kinetic energy to manifest. The old manual elevator, which has had its main power grid completely disconnected for 30 years, regularly activates on its own. People standing on the ground floor can hear the heavy steel cables groaning and snapping as the carriage slowly descends from the upper levels. The elevator doors will slide open with a loud, metallic screech, revealing a completely empty cab that smells intensely of old cigar smoke, the exact brand preferred by the hospital's chief surgeon in the 1940s. If an investigator is brave enough to step inside, the elevator will often lock its doors and take them directly to the basement morgue, bypassing all control panels entirely. In the patient wards on the second floor, the haunting takes on a deeply sorrowful tone. The original call button system, which patients use to summon nurses to their bedsides, still functions on a supernatural circuit. The central master board at the nurse's station will suddenly light up, a loud mechanical buzz echoing through the empty hallway, indicating that a patient in room 214 needs help. When investigators walk down the corridor to check the room, they frequently find the rusty metal bed frame vibrating violently, as if someone is having a severe seizure on the mattress. The audio recorded in these rooms is heartbreaking. Microphones capture the faint, raspy breathing of someone on the verge of death, punctuated by the occasional desperate plea, "Where is the doctor? It burns." The Old Toole County Hospital serves as a terrifying reminder that some spirits are so bound by duty, routine, or the trauma of their professions that they cannot move on. The entities here do not seem to realize that time has passed or that the hospital is no longer operational. They treat living visitors not as guests, but as intruders disrupting a medical emergency, or worse, as new patients who need to be prepped for surgery. Those who stay inside the facility past midnight often report a sudden, overpowering sensation of paralysis, followed by the sound of metal surgical instruments clinking together right next to their ears. It is an active, loops of time haunting that ensnares anyone who steps inside, threatening to make them a permanent resident in a hospital where the graveyard shift never ends.